Now, this was identified as a possible silicic construct by Bringham et al. In 2017. Now, we use a variety of spectroscopic methods to try and find out whether these are silicic lithologies or not. So we've used particular instruments on these missions for the morphology, some for the composition, some we use for the gravity data, right? And then for all of these, we have to use certain specific spectral analysis techniques, right? And we use the ones that are defined out here. Now, when we look at the morphology of the Wolf-Crater complex, now I won't go into the technical details of exactly what we did, but when you divide the Wolf-Crater into several different parts, just for the purposes of studying the morphology, what you notice is that all of these features, they have astonishing similarities with features that are characteristic of collinear collapse or nothing. So it appears that there were fault-bounded features along which things collapsed in the center. So the crater it really seems to be created as a caldera rather than a meteoritic impact crater. And not just one, there are several stages of this collapse that we can see. Now, from the sides of the complex that we've seen, we can see that there are lobate features which are protruding down and solidified. These are most likely to be melts that solidified as they were pouring down. So as they were moving down, because they were so viscous, as a silicic melt is likely to be because it's so polymerized, so they would tend to form lobate flows. Now, the central part, that is this particular region, that is filled with mare basalts. So this part is actually filled with mare basalts. The crater rims themselves are elevated above the central part. All these features tell us that this crater, the Wolf-Crater complex, was not created by meteoritic impact. So it must have been created by some alternative technique, and that particular thing is most likely to be a volcano. So it must have been a volcano that erupted and the caldera was created because of the collapse of the central part. So now, if we now try to see the composition of features around the Wolf-Crater, you see this is a map of the emissivity spectra, and this is called the Christensen value. Now the blue bars have low Christensen feature values. Now the lower the value, the Christensen feature is a feature in the emissivity spectra, which is related to silicon-oxygen bond vibrations. So if there are a lot of silicon-oxygen bond vibrations, the larger the amount, the energy associated with these vibrations is very large. As a consequence, what happens is the energy that is actually emitted also happens to be higher from these particular bonds. So areas that contain more silica will actually emit vibrations which are higher energy. If they have higher energy, it means they'll have lower wavelengths. And the Christensen feature is measured by its wavelength. So if the wavelengths are less than 8, it tells you that these particular features are most likely to be very silica rich. And as you can see, the blue region is all around what we think is the rim of the crater. So that is dominantly composed of rocks which are likely to have more than 65 weight % silica. And you can see that the floor of the crater is very different. This is the part which we think is mare basalt. Now, we have other minerals apart from silica-rich things that make it up. And among these are pyroxenes and you have magnesium sphaler. Now, among the pyroxenes, you have both low calcium pyroxenes, you have high calcium pyroxenes, both forms are present. And these spread across this particular domain of composition space in the pyroxenes. Now, another interesting feature is the presence of this magnesium sphaler. Right? It is MgO.823. This coexists with silica-rich parts. This is very strange because this is a mineral which is very deficient in silica, and yet it is coexisting with silica-rich ones. So how can we actually explain this coexistence? This is what we're seeing on the moon. It's not something that we see on Earth. If you look at the results from the geophysical information we have, that is the gravity data. The gravity data, it's got from the Grail instrument, and there we do the Boger gravity anomaly, the studies, and you can actually see that it indicates that this low-density material, silica-rich material, is less dense than material that has lower quantities of silica. So the silica-rich material itself, which is less dense, extends down into the crust up to a depth of at least 30 kilometers. We can tell that for sure. That means the crust below this is 30 kilometers. It's it's granitic or silicic in composition up to that depth at least. So the rest of it is anorthositic, and you've got basalts around it. Nevertheless, you have parts that are silicic, which actually extend to considerably great depths. Now, what about the age? How old was this silicic magnetism, if we think it is? Now, if we look at the rims of the crater, so RZs are the rims of the crater, and you can get the age. We've not got samples, so it's not an isotopic date. So what you do is to date them based on a technique called the crater size frequency distribution. And when you use that, you get ages which vary from 3.8 to 3.6 billion years. That is the age of the silicic rocks at the rims of the volcano. The central part of the volcano, on the other hand, which is basalt, it just simply got rocks which is 2.6 to just 2 billion years. So these erupted afterwards, after the caldera collapsed in the central part. So if I now take all of these features together, we have features that indicate viscous lava flows. We have caldera collapse structures. There are a few post-caldera domes, which are also silicic in nature around it. The compositional constraints, like low distance and feature position. We have very low iron oxide abundance. This is important because it overrules one particular theory that we talked about just now. And you have an overall low mafic mineral abundance there. And of course, then you have low gravity signatures up to about 30 kilometers. All these features, if you take them together, these are consistent with the existence of a silicic volcano on the Moon. So you must have had a silicic volcano 3.6 to 3.8 to 3.6 billion years old on the Moon. Today, it exists as a volcanic volcano. Now, how did this silicic volcanism originate? Now, the interesting part here is this existence of the magnesium spinel. Now, magnesium spinel in coexistence with silicic constructs. This is not something that's usual, but we see it in the Wolf Crater complex. And this really suggests that the origin of the silicic magma was most likely by melting of rocks such that you actually get silicic-rich melts and spinel together. And this can only happen in systems. Those who are familiar with igneous spectrology would recollect a system called the fossilite anorthite system, the olivine plagioclase system. And that system, in between, there is a field of spinel. Now, whenever spinel crystallizes from a system which contains fossilite and anorthite, then in that case, the corresponding melt has to be extremely silica-rich. Now, fossilite and anorthite is an essential component of one major type of lunar rock, and that is called a proctorite. That is very common on the Moon, and it exists along with the anorthosites in the highlands on the Moon. So, if you have proctorites present anywhere and they melt, you will actually get silica, magnesium silica, and granites together formed at the same location. Now, if one of the alternatives, you could have had silicate liquid immiscibility, fractionating of dry silicic magma into the field of silicate liquid immiscibility, such that you actually separate one part out into a very silica-rich composition, and the other part which is, of intermediate composition. That also seems very unlikely, because in that case, all the mafic minerals that you can actually see around it would be extremely iron-rich, and that is not what we are able to see. And of course, we see these high thorium constraints. This is compatible, it's incompatible with silicate liquid immiscibility, but it's completely consistent, right, with the formation of melting of proctorites. So in other words, lunar silicic magmas, these appear to have formed by crustal melting of pre-existing rocks by basaltic underplating, and these pre-existing crustal rocks are most likely to be of the compositions such as proctorites. Now, if you look at this, though, what triggered this magmatism? When the Moon actually formed, we believe there was an early lunar magma ocean, and this crystallized to form a cumulate layer of anorthosite, proctolite, gabbro-norite, all these things, forming the lunar crust. Then, between 4 to 3.5 billion years ago, the lunar mantle underwent a huge overturn. So the bottom of the lunar mantle moved to the top. And when it did this, there was extensive lunar mantle melting. The belts that were created at that time, they kept hitting the base of the crust. And because these were hot stuff, when they hit the base of the crust, if the crust, whatever the crustal material was, it would be automatically melted. So wherever there were proctorites, they would melt to form silicic melts. Now, the crust is so thick that these melts will not be able to rise to the top and be exposed as we see it. The only way that you can do it is if you have meteoritic impacts that will kill the crust and create fractures. And that is exactly what we see. The timing coincides with the late heavy bombardment on the moon. And as a consequence, what we created pathways for granitic or silicic magmas to rise to the surface of the moon. So we think that this is the only model that is really consistent with what we see on the moon. Now, the late heavy bombardment is a period of an intense meteoritic bombardment of the Earth-Moon system, which occurred between 4.1 to 3.8 billion years ago. And therefore, this probably was instrumental in the emplacement of these felsic massifs on the moon. Surprisingly, if you notice this time period, this is also the age of the oldest silicic rocks we have on Earth. Perhaps the same kind of mechanism could have created the nucleus of the earliest continents on Earth. We still don't know, it's out, the jury is still out on it. Now, we've created, let's say, we have a method in which even with a dry basaltic rock, we can actually create, somehow we can actually create silicic magma. The problem is to sustain granitic magmatism on planetary bodies, you actually need to have introduced a lot of water into the shallow levels of the mantle. That is an essential prerequisite. Now, on the moon, that was clearly not possible. The moon is much too dry. What about the other planets? Do we see any evidence on Mars, for example? Another planet where we've recently been able to send rovers. Do we see any evidence for that on Mars, that there was surface water there? Now, Mars itself, apart from this tasty little bit, is actually a planet. And it's this fourth planet when we move away from the sun. So this is where it is, distance-wise. If you compare it with the Earth, it's smaller than the Earth. It is lighter than the Earth. Its surface is basalt, but it is heavily cratered. And the age of this old crust, right, is much older than the oldest crust we see on Earth. So the Martian crust is 4.5, more than 4.5 billion years old. And again, like the Earth, Mars also happens to have a crustal dichotomy. It's got a heavily cratered southern highland, and you've got very smooth lying northern lowlands here. Let's see. Oops, yeah. So these are the northern lowlands, and these are the southern highlands. And you can see that these are about 2 to 3 kilometers elevated above the lowlands there. Now, if we look at Mars in this context now, the questions we are asking for Mars is, did it ever have water on its surface? And if it had water, was it at some time able to sustain any life on that planet? If there was, it's clearly not there now, how do we begin to look for it? I mean, how do we from Earth begin to search for that life on Mars? And then we have to think of some techniques which are signatures through which we can actually identify any evidence that we have of life on those planets. Now, to answer this very question, first of all, to find out if water was there on Mars, right? The Mars Exploration Rover program was begun by NASA. And the Opportunity rover was actually directed to land on a part of the Martian surface that had evidence of weathering, of aqueous weathering. Now, this really means that it was red. We know Mars is known as the red planet. And one of the reasons is that it's red is that it contains a lot of iron in the basalt on its surface. And most of that iron, when it's oxidized and becomes wet, it becomes like rust, and it's red in color. So this spectral signature was detected from the orbiter nations. So what they tried to do is to actually send out rovers to actually determine whether there is anything that can be interpreted in that particular manner. So Opportunity actually landed on one of the places where you had this particular signature, and where it landed is a place called the Meridianian Planet. It's actually at the boundaries between the highlands and the lowlands. Now, when it landed, astonishingly, what it found was a basaltic crust. And on top of the basalt, it actually found sedimentary rocks with cross-bearing. And this sedimentologists actually studying this, began looking from the photographs, they actually said that these were all reworked evaporites, which would overlie the basaltic crust. This was named Burns Formation for a man who predicted this many years before anything landed there. And when you look at this particular region here, the Burns Formation, the sedimentology indicated that they had been transported under both subaqueous, which meant that there was water on the surface, liquid water, and also wind action together. These were responsible for actually creating these particular sedimentary rocks themselves, on the Burns Formation, on Mars. Now, this was what they expected to see. Right? But what they also noticed, astonishingly, is that when it landed there, apart from the oil, the hematite which they were looking for, they also found evidence of hydrous sulfate mineral called jarosite. Now, this mineral jarosite, it made up almost 10% of the outcrop that you could see on the Meridianian planet. Now, this is surprising in a way, but then after more rovers were sent to different parts, jarosite, we realize, is now present all over the Martian surface. It's quite widespread. Now, why is this such a surprise? Now, this is the formula of jarosite, right? So it's hydrous sulfate. Now, it is important fundamentally, first of all, because from this group here, you realize that its existence requires the presence of water. Otherwise, you can't get hydroxyl groups. Secondly, the iron that you see here is entirely ferric iron. It is not ferrous. So you must have had oxidizing conditions on the Martian surface if you wanted to create this particular molecule. And of course then, because it's sulfate here, and from experimental and thermodynamic evidence, we know that this particular mineral can only precipitate from waters that are extremely acidic. That is, the pH value is less than 3. Now, on Earth, jarosite is only very rarely associated with basalts, unlike what we see on Mars. And these low pH waters, these can only, it can really survive within acidic rocks, but in contact with very basic rocks like basalt, it would immediately be neutralized. The acidic waters would be neutralized. So then, to understand, how jarosite can exist on Mars and what it actually indicates, we need to look at an Earth analog. Is it possible that on Earth we have a similar sort of system, which way we can actually try to begin to understand the jarosite forms? Now, this is difficult because jarosite is very rare on Earth. Although it's rare, it doesn't mean it's absent. And interestingly, we do find this in one place in India, and that is in Kutch, which is, okay, probably use this. Yeah, okay. So, this area of Kutch, it's a place in Kutch called Matarmanat. It's a village, right? And this is on the way to there. This is a person whom many of you might know. Now, this area is within the Deccan Traps. It's part of the Deccan Traps. So you have the Deccan Traps on which the Cenozoic succession is laid, and below it you have the Jurassic. Now, there is a stratigraphic succession. This is the Cenozoic part of the succession. It's not very important to realize what the rest of the succession is, but immediately above the Deccan Traps, there is a discontinuous unit, which people have called the Matarmanat Formation. And this is the one which is of interest to us, that lies immediately above the basalts. Now, the Deccan Traps themselves are made of these columns here. So you see these around the basalts, which is where fresh samples of basalt can be collected. Now, the upper part of the basalt is very weathered, and it forms these spheroids. So it's characteristically showing spheroidal weathering. So clay minerals tend to form here, and this is very typical of the rocks that you see above the basalts. And just above this, then, you find these sedimentary rocks, right? Many of which contain shale horizons where you have these cross-cutting yellow veins, and these cross-cutting yellow veins also are parallel to it. So both parallel and cross-cutting. Now, these veins are on horizons that are just above the basalt. These veins themselves, when you analyze them spectroscopically using a variety of techniques, all confirm the existence of these hydrous sulfate mineral, and it is jarosite. So it does exist in a natural setting in India, just above a basalt, in sedimentary rocks, just above the basalt, which is remarkably similar to the situation that you see on Mars. So it's a fantastic analog in that particular way. But what is important here is that since it's cross-cutting, it's clearly not primary. So this mineral was actually formed after the rock formed. So it's something that formed afterwards, something that was created afterwards. Now, the question is, why did jarosite form in this setting under natural conditions on Mars? In Kutch, for example, at Matarmanat. Now, it was secondary in nature, so it wasn't related to sulfur emanations from the Deccan volcanism. It was not related to that, as some people initially suggested. this post-dated it. However, we know that jarosite has another property. It actually coexists with one, or it exists or thrives under water-limited conditions. And water-limited conditions means that the water is to rock ratio must be low. It means that it's wet, but it's not completely dry. You have a low water is to rock ratio. Under these conditions, Kutch itself, we can see that the original sedimentary rocks must have been deposited when there was a lot of water inside the rocks. But then, ultimately, Kutch today is extremely arid, so there was a change in the climate. And we think that that is really about the time when jarosites precipitated, when the amount of water was actually decreasing. So, how does this reflect on Mars? It actually tells us quite simply why jarosite is surviving on Mars. Because this was created at a time when Mars, whose surface actually had a lot of liquid water, lost that liquid water. The Martian surface dried up at some time in the past. Incidentally, this timing was also around 3.8 million years ago, coincides with the time of the late heavy bombardment. So all of these conditions seem to tie up. We have evidence now on Mars that there was liquid water, and we lost that liquid water for some reason in the past. Now, on Mars, we know that we had liquid water. It had an oxidizing atmosphere. So the obvious last part of the question that we would ask is, did Mars host life at that time? You had oxygen, you had water. What if it did have some evidence of life present on it? Now, the fact is that if you want to stabilize life, water and oxygen are not enough. You need some critical elements to be present. And what are these critical elements? The elements that you need to stabilize life is obviously carbohydrates. You need carbon, you need hydrogen, you need oxygen. You need to have sulfur. Sulfur stabilizes protein structures. You also need to have a variety of any of these elements. Boron, molybdenum, germanium, vanadium. Any of these elements, if they are present, they can be vital in stabilizing the structures that you can actually see in many types of carbohydrates. Now, they don't do this in their elemental form. They only do this when they combine with oxygen as borates, molybdates, germanates, or vanadates. And in that case, what they do is they stabilize the structure of organic molecules, particularly pentoses, 5-carbon sugars. So these structures are actually stabilized by the presence of these elements, if any of these are present. Now, knowing this, NASA sent another rover. This was Perseverance. And this was with the mission of trying to detect life on Mars. Now, the thing is, it was detecting features, trying to detect features where it can be, but it's really actually looking for a needle in a haystack. How do we make out whether it contains life or not? The only thing is a combination of spectral signatures. So what are we actually looking for? What kind of signatures do we think Perseverance should be looking for? Now this is what we are trying to detect. If we have these signatures which sustain life, what should we see? Where should we look? Now on Earth, for example, it was thought initially that the earliest forms of life, they were sustained in the vicinity of submarine hydrothermal vents. So this was actually photographed by David Attenborough first. But then from that time, people thought that this was the earliest evidence of life. Maybe that's where it originates. However, now we think that it's probably a little different. Right? The reason is that if you continuously subject any particular parts of these nucleotides below water continuously, these will not be stabilized. So what you need are alternate wet and dry spells. So you need to have spells in which it's underwater, you have to provide water, remove the water. That dry period allows the nucleotide to stabilize. And then that can then polymerize and form ribonucleic acid, which is the essential ingredient from which life would start. So you need these alternating wet-dry cycles. Now clearly, alternating wet and dry cycles are impossible below oceans. They are continuously underwater. So the only place that you can think of where you can get alternating wet and dry cycles would have to be on the continents. So again, the first part of my talk, the continents, where it comes in. To sustain life, you need continents. But what are these potential localities on continents? Now, to stabilize life, you need some extra energy. And that is most likely wherever you have hot springs on Earth. So the heat energy of the hot springs, these can create potential habitats, even if they are extreme environments. What they do is to form, in biological terms, they form continental warm little ponds, hot water ponds. And they have alternating wet and dry cycles. So the water collects, evaporates, and then these particularly are features that are common near hot springs. And then, if near these hot springs you have those critical elements necessary for life, you can actually form life and stabilize life. So in other words, if we can identify some such hot spring on Earth, right, with this combination of factors, we know the spectra that perseverance needs to look for in order to detect life. So, what do we need? We need an Earth analog. So we need to look for a place on Earth where there are hydrosulfate minerals, because the hydrosulfate minerals like alumni, jarosite, and gypsum, because they are formed under water-limited conditions, it means that you have to have dry and wet cycles together. Opaline silica, these are intrinsically linked to hot springs and freezes. And if you get borates, that would provide the critical missing link for stabilizing nucleotides. Now, this is important, but why boron in particular? Why not molybdenum? Why not germanium? Why not vanadium? That is because the element boron has been reported already from Mars. We know boron exists, but we don't know if that boron is in the form of borates. Why is that important? Now, boron is one of the key elements. We know what it does specifically. It controls the reactivity of prebiotic organic compounds. And these are compounds such as dextroses, heptoses, pentoses, etc. These stabilize carbohydrates as well as ribose. And of course, as I said, boron has been found in a Martian meteorite. It's also been found, reported recently, from the Gale crater, from a calcium sulfate fracture present within the Gale crater itself. Now, in India, there is one such site that has more or less these conditions, and that's the Kuba hot spring in Ladakh. So it's a beautiful area, it's a geothermal field, we know the hot springs are there, it's a tourist spot. And if you look at this place, then you actually find spectra which tells you that gypsum is present. So this is gypsum, this is opal, you can actually see this in the SEM image, and you get spectra which confirms their presence. This is the spectra of gypsum, this is the spectra of opal. And you see these fractures these are the places where they actually stabilize in Puka. You also have hydrous sulfates, you find alunites, and then I think you have a jarosite also. So the spectra confirms the presence of wet dry cycles in Puna. So you have all the features that you actually need. And not just that, finally, you have borates in Puna. And you actually have algal mats stabilizing in that particular environment. It's an extreme environment. You can see because not a blade of grass grows there, but you've got these algal mats which are actually capable of being stabilized in these environments themselves. So all of these features together are present in the Puga Valley. So you can actually see this in the visual vicinity of the hot springs. So why is this important then? The Puga hot springs, these are excellent terrestrial analogs. If you want to study Martian evaporites, borate mineralization on Mars, but of course if you can fully characterize the spectral signature of that locality, the geochemistry that we can interpret on the basis of spectral signatures right now from that and correspond, because we have an analog where we can test out these things. It can be invaluable for identifying extinct, maybe even extinct, hot springs on Mars. And these hot springs will be the ones which are most likely to be of astrobiological significance. Now, so let's wrap up the whole thing together. The moral of the story. For us to survive on this particular planet, a number of factors had to converge. Now, we needed to have a surface temperature that stabilized liquid water. For that, we needed to have continents to form, and we needed them to protrude above sea level. Now, we know that continents are formed of silica-rich rocks, and these can form from planets which have silicate interiors, right? And these are produced by more than 1 or 2 stages of partial melting. Now, the earliest continental nuclei, they may not have had the water to form. They could have resulted from meteoritic impacts. So it might have actually formed the nucleus from which the continents then grew. However, if you want to form larger continents, as we do on Earth, this must be because you had surface water which was carried down by processes such as plate tectonics into the shallow mantle. And when you melt the mantle under hydrous conditions, you get basalt, which is water rich and which can fractionate to give you a silicic mantle. Now, surface water needs to be present and to circulate into the mantle, and this circulation of liquid water from the surface into the mantle, that needs plate tectonics, and only the Earth no one has that among the planets we've seen and the planetary bodies we've seen. And of course, finally, you need an energy source and you need a combination of critical elements. And you need them to all get together on a continent in order for life to stabilize, in order for life to proliferate. Ultimately, then, you begin to realize that we are really lucky to be able to live on this particular planet. This is an image from the lunar reconnaissance orbiter, right? This is an image of the frontal part of the moon, and this is the Earth rising on the horizon. I think at this point, the only thing we can actually realize is we're really very, very lucky that we live on this planet. Because all those different factors, they had to come together for us to create life on this planet, for us ultimately to be hearing a lecture here in this particular theatre. So, at the end of it, I would like once again to express my extreme gratitude to Professor Jean-Claude Bosch, to the Department of Geology of Presidency University for the invitation to the Geological Institute. I'm a proud member of it still. I remember Dr. Shah saying that in our very first class in the new lecture theatre, that you are here, you automatically become members of the Geological Institute. Happy to know it's still there. And the final image that I think we should leave with is this particular photograph which we excavated from our classmates a few days back. So this has Professor Kolkata there, naming all the others. This is Abhijit Chattopadhyay, my batchmates in our third year batch BSc field trip. This is Priyavruta Saha. This is Abhijit Banerjee. Shamir Kumar Bhattacharya was the topper of our batch. Deepan Jha is a name who Presidency University might be familiar with because he's donated a lot of equipment here, and I think he's also planning to give something more. That's what he told me a few days back. This is Joydeep Mukhopadhyay. He's also in the West Bengal government in Kolkata. Ranadev Mukhopadhyay is not in geology anymore. Arnav Bhattacharya, we've lost contact with him. Orijit Datta, not doing geology, but he's somewhere in Africa doing corporate work. Devabrata Prime, he is still based in, he's now in Durgapur, final stages of his, just before his retirement. Prosenjit Hans is the person we were discussing a few minutes back. He's currently also based in Kolkata. Right now he's in the US. Shivabrata Boshak is in SAIL, Steel Authority of India. He's high-flying general manager of geology there. Probir Pal is a big LIC operative. Probir Panda, he was of a senior batch, but he didn't speak with us. I don't know where he is. Saibal Gupta, who was lucky enough to get a plane ticket last night to go to Hyderabad. He's a DDG of the GSI. So he managed to avoid attending this talk. Gautam Kundu, I don't know where he is, really lost complete contact with him. This year is yours truly. Two people are missing from here who were in this. One is Suhas Chaudhary. I don't know where exactly he is at this instant. He was supposed to be here. He was with us in the field trip. And of course, Bhaskar Bhattacharya. He's never there in any of our photographs. He was always our photographer. So with this, and with a final little bit, mark of respect to this gentleman, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for the thought-provoking presentation. So normally we do not offer question and answer in invited lectures, but if the speaker agrees, we can take a few questions from the audience, especially from the students.
Well, it could be anybody. Students is most welcome. And speaker does agree. When the speaker can't answer the question, he'll feel tired. So you can go ahead and ask. Students are always reluctant to ask questions. Yes?
Thank you, sir, for this wonderful talk. Sir, you said that about 4 billion years ago, Martian maintained overturn. What is the reason behind that?
4 billion years, the lunar mantle overturn.
Lunar mantle.
Okay, it's the subject of another work that is currently in review. Right? So it's an experiment. When the whole of the moon is at some time is believed to have melted. So the lunar mantle melted. When it melted, it produced a lot of material in which there was a lot of basalt. There were cumulates formed at the bottom which form the mantle of the moon today. And at the top you had layers of amatosite and the cumulates. The part in between, that is where the last bits of melt were crystallizing. Now, for some reason, the moon contains a lot of titanium and iron. And this little melt in the middle sandwiched layer, which was just below the crust, this last bit of melt contained titanium, contained iron, and this was liquid. Now, this iron titanium liquid is extremely dense. It is denser than the material that had already crystallized. So what happens is that this density difference caused an instability because of which the whole thing overturned. When it overturns, hot material at its bottom, when you decompress, there is a phenomenon called decompression melting. That is why we get melting in the mid-ocean ridges. So really, that is the reason why there was a lunar mantle overturn.
Thank you, sir.
Anybody else?
It was a very good question, actually. Yes, please.
Yeah. I just read somewhere 2 years back there was some recent samples where they discovered some granitic rocks, which I think dated close to the Castanites, 3.9, 3.8, something like that. Can you just elaborate?
Well, I don't know the dating part, but yes, you're absolutely right. The lunar return samples that I talked about, some of them actually did contain microgranites. So they were granophyres. What is most interesting is, if it's a granophyre, it must have formed at the eutectic. So you know there must have been a liquid. So we know it's there. 3.8 and 3.9 is roughly the time. In fact, most of these silicic constructs are of that age. And there is a very strong correlation with this late heavy bombardment. So that's why we think that it's connected. And if it was the case, if meteorites bombarded the moon, they must have bombarded the Earth as well. The Earth has a much larger surface area to bombard. So, I mean, it's interesting that the oldest continental rocks we see are also roughly about that age.
Thank you, Professor Gupta. It's a wonderful talk. So, just in continuation to his query, do you mean that it's a sort of mechanism like salt dome? Salt dome formation?
Sort of. The salt dome is that the salt is, gravitationally or density-wise, it's lower. It's a lower density than the material on top. Yeah. Right? That's how it goes up. It is a sort of that where it's the difference is that this is initiated by a gravity instability at the bottom in the case of a salt dome.
Yeah.
In this case, the gravity instability is at the top.
But the final picture will be the same, right?
Yeah, there won't be an overturn. See, the whole idea of an overturn comes from lake dynamics. So it was basically the idea that things could overturn. It came from a lake in Siberia. A whole set of 3 or 4 villages died overnight due to methane poisoning. And what had happened there is that the lake overnight had overturned. So you had rotten material at the bottom where methane had accumulated. And then because of an inversion in the density, then the whole overnight it overturned and the methane was released. And because it's heavier, it just spread into the villages, and I think several villages together were suffocated. That's when the idea of this overturn, maybe in Fiji came.
Thank you, Professor Gupta. I have just a very simple question. See, you indicate kind of dating of some events in the lunar perspective. Now, how those dating, if you compare with the dating which has been made, radiogenic dating in the Earth's crust, how they are organically connected. They are two different altogether methods. No? So can you just say that these can be comparable in that way?
But the reason that they correlate is because of this, because of the lunar return samples. So what was done is that, what I believe was done, is that on the moon, because we had return samples, people dated them. And we knew where we had collected those samples, and they correlated this with the impact, the frequency of the craters on that particular surface. So the calibration is against radiometric dating on the moon. Now that has been extrapolated to other planets. For example, Mars, Venus, etc. So the surface ages are calibrated against what we see on the moon. We don't have return samples obviously from those places. And when we get them, they might tell us that we are wrong. But for the moon, we have a much better control because we know we have a control because some samples are dated. We know it. I think the students are getting tired anyway, and so is she.
So we come to the end of the question answer session. Now I would like to call upon stage Head Department of Geology to hand over a token of gesture to the speaker to mark this occasion. To conclude the event, I would now like to call Secretary of Geological Institute, Kingshuk Pal, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Shamprona. Good evening, everyone. It's my privilege to deliver the vote of thanks on this special occasion. First and foremost, I extend my heartfelt gratitude to Professor Saibal Gupta for his inspiring and thought-provoking lecture. His talk was a remarkable blend of deep scientific insight and broad interdisciplinary elements. We are truly honored to have had the opportunity to learn from such a distinguished scholar. A special word of thanks to our distinguished alumni, whose unwavering support, thoughtful suggestions, and generous financial contributions have played a key role in accomplishment of the events throughout the year. I extend my sincere thanks to the Honorable Vice Chancellor and the authorities of Presidency University for their invaluable suggestions and constant support, without which conducting this program wouldn't have been possible. I would like to convey my deepest thanks to all the fellow research scholars, undergrad and postgraduate students whose active participation to conduct all these events throughout the year make the event successful. We deeply acknowledge the speakers and participants of all programs held in the last few months during our centenary celebrations. Thanks due to all the sponsors who made us realize our dreams. I would like to convey my deepest thanks to our faculty members and departmental staff whose dedication in organizing the year-long events have been contributory to the success of the birth centenary celebrations of Professor A.K. Saha. I would also like to thank all the faculty members, students and guests who have joined us today in offline as well as in online and contributed in making this session engaging and meaningful with their presence and thoughtful questions. Lastly, thank you all once again for being a part of this enriching experience. We look forward to carry this spirit and keep the ideas of Professor Ajit Kumar Saha alive. Thank you all. I would now like to request all to proceed for a cup of tea outside the hall. Thanks.